Yeah, amen.
Right, Chevra, it's easy dafim over here. Mamish. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Pesachim Daf Lamed Zayin. We're going to be starting out today's daf, asking whether a person can make matzahs, breads, with designs on them, like happy birthday matzahs. And as we'll see, that sometimes when you make these fancy breads, it takes you a longer while to make them properly, and that might turn those breads into chametz. So whether there's a problem making those breads or not. We're going to go on from there to speak about all different types of unusual breads. And the ikar will be breads that are not baked in an oven, but they are, so to say, fried in a pan. And the question will be both benegeya, whether those breads are good to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah, in where the Torah says we have to have lechem. I know lechem oini, but we're going to focus on the word lechem. And hand in hand, a big part of today's daf, we'll be asking whether such breads are obligated to have challah removed from them. The mitzvah of challah that's written in Parsha Shalach, that when you have the amount of 43.2 or 43.3 eggs in volume, that you're mechuyev to separate challah, if it's made out of any one of the 5 grains or a mixture of the 5 grains. Here again, we're going to be learning about how the bread is prepared, whether there's something that is done to the bread that no longer renders it bread, and therefore it will be exempt from the obligation of challah, as well as, hand in hand, you won't be able to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah because it's not considered lechem. Now we're going to have the big machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish regarding frying something in a pan, whether it's considered lechem or not. We're going to, God willing, speak out the big machlokes that comes all the way down on Shulchan Aruch between the Rabbeinu Tam, that is on Pesachim Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, and mamish all the other Rishonim, how the Rabbeinu Tam limits the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And God willing, if we'll have time at the end of the daf, we're going to move on to asking whether if you make bread from the grain of Meiser Sheni, whether you're obligated to separate challah or not. Yes, this is linked in part to that which we learned yesterday, the machlokes between Rabbi Yossi Haglili and Rabbi Akiva regarding fulfilling the mitzvah of eating matzah with Meiser Sheni. But really what we're going to start learning now is machlokes that we have in Masechtas Kedushin. We have the sheet of Rav Meir that holds that Meiser Sheni is called Mamein Gavoya. Even though I'm allowed to eat my Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim, but it's considered God's property. And therefore, for example, when it comes to challah, and the Torah says, Reishis Arisoy Seichem, that from the first of your doughs you have to separate challah. Once we view it as property of God, as mama and gavaya, then it's not Arisoy Seichem, and indeed that is Shitas Rav Meir, you'll be exempt from taking off challah and many other dinim. But really, this is a baker's daf. It's all going to be about all different types of breads of lechem. We left off in the 4th line in the wide lines already, all right, by the dot Tanu Rabbanon. And as we mentioned, the first topic today will be about preparing certain unusual types of breads, b'chlal, for Pesach. So Tanu Rabbanon, the Brisa is beginning speaking about whether one can fulfill one's obligation, one's chiyuv of eating matzah, yoitzin bepas nekiya. You fulfill your obligation if the challah, if the matzah bread is made out of very white, refined flour, and that is as behemshich to what we learned yesterday, that even though we learned lechem oini also means pashut, a poor man's bread, and therefore certain fancy types of bread are no longer considered oini. Right, matzah shira cannot be used to fulfill the obligation of achilas matzah. But when you refine the flour, it's very nice, but it doesn't take that away from lechem oini. Still considered lechem oini, and it could be done. You can fulfill your obligation. Similarly, says the Brisa ubahad ra'ah, you can also fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah if the grain is completely unrefined, if it is coarse bread. Right, what we call today whole wheat, the bran is not removed, that's also okay. And ubesirikin hamitzuyanim, and with decorated sirikin shaped matzahs. What are sirikin shaped matzahs? It's a bread that either is in a form of a design or there's some sort of design made on top of it with the dough. So says the Braisa that you can fulfill the obligation of chiyuv eating matzah, and afal pi sha'amru ein oisim sirikin amitziyarim Pesach, even though lechatchila one should not make such a decorative bread for matzah on Pesach, as we'll learn, because you might linger while you make it to make the design a nicer design. Now, the truth be told, that over here there's another issue that the Gemara, that the Braisa is not focusing on, and that is, if you have a design on top of a piece of bread, how can you eat that on Shabbos or on Yom Tiv? Are you not erasing that design? When it comes to letters, it's very, the Rebbe made the whole campaign of making birthday parties and making birthday cakes. And it's people put, happy birthday, a mazel tov, and they put the person's name down. Having that on the cake and eating it up is problematic. The ideal way to do it now is, as you know, we have this little slab of chocolate or some sort of cookie upon which you have letters written. And then before you cut it on Shabbos and on Yom Tov, for you not to violate mechika, you just remove that entire chocolate piece. But here we're speaking about a design on the matzah itself. So indeed, you should know that the Magen Avram over here says that there's a difference between letters and a design. That when the design is made out of the bread or here out of the matzah, it's not problematic as far as moichik or mechiko or erasing is concerned, because you're eating up the bread. And that's true whether you have a piece of bread and you have some additional dough that makes a design on top of it, or whether the bread itself is not this circular matzah or a square matzah, it's a design. So we don't say, it's a design, it looks like a little shepsela, how can you erase it? No, you're cutting up, you're eating up the piece of bread. There's no problem with that. As far as moichik is concerned, again, the issue here will be whether you are allowed to make such a matzah on Pesach itself. And indeed, Omar, here must be a Rebbe with a Yud, it's a Tanach, Omar Rabbi Yehuda, that Dover Zeh Shol Baisus Ben Zoinen Lachachamim, Mepnei Ma Omru Ein Oisen Tzirikin Amitziyarim Pesach. Again, your yoitze, once you made it and it's not chametzik, it's not going to be removed from lechem oini. It's still called lechem oini enough, poor man's bread. But when we spoke about you shouldn't make it, why should you not make it? So Amrulai, so they told Baisus, because since you're trying to make a design on the bread or with the bread, in the bread, so it's pashut, we don't overly rush, but we have this very care to make sure, today we go with the 18 minutes, but from beginning until the end, it should not be more than 18 minutes. And the moment you start patching around, you're opening yourself up to a situation where it's going to take more than the minimum amount of time, and God forbid it's going to become chametzik. Omar Lohem asks Baisus, why is making a design something that should be shoya, that should make people linger, that efshe yasenu bitfus, you can have a form, and v'yikbe'en kivon, and you can imprint the design at once. If you have a form, many cookies have forms, just imprint the form in it. And that won't take any time. So Amrullah, so they told him, I know that certain people, you have a form. Not everyone has a form. But only Sirike Baisus Mutarin. No, they didn't want to make like plug. They didn't want to say, well, if you have the form like Baisus, then you can do it. Bakers that don't have the form, then they lachatchila should not do it. So they said the lachatchila don't do it. But again, if you did it, it doesn't render that into matzah ashira. You can be yoitza, but don't make those types of breads. And Vaita says the Braisa, Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Sadoik, Pamachas nechnasti acharav. I once was following my father. In other words, Sadoik, while he went lebeis Rabban Gamliel, and they viu lefon of Sirikin Amitziyarim Pesach, and they brought these types of fancy shaped matzahs on Pesach. And Omarti Abba loikach omru chachamim. Did we not teach that ein oisen Sirikin Amitziyarim Pesach? In other words, so why is it here? How did they make it? So Amar Li, so he told me, Beni, loy shall kol adam amru. No, this shita is, they did not make a loy plug. They didn't make a iser lachatchila across the board. They differentiated that ela shel nachtoimin amru. And according to this version, like Rashi explains, that a balabais is one, right, that on a shel adam, loy al shel adam amru. A balabas is allowed to make a design on the matzah, because like Rashi says, that we're not trying to make it so beautiful. It's not professional. So just adding a little bit of a design is something that is so insignificant in the addition of lingering shoyha bizman that we're not concerned. The fear that Chazal had was when a baker is making something, like Rashi says, so oisim limkoir, they're going to sell it, umakpidim al noyem, and they want it to be perfect. Their taka, they should not make it. We went to someone's private residence, and according to him, they never made a gzeda that in your private residence, yeah, you can make a matzah designed with a form, with a design on it, or amru, ikeda amri, that it was the opposite. Hachika amarle, loy shal nachtoim amru. Forget the matzah that we are eating was made by a baker, and they never made a gzeda on the baker. Why? Because bakers have forms. Bakers have professional kalim. And like we just learned above, the objection of Baisus benzoinen, that you have a tfus, it's not a problem if you're just going to put a form in, it's going to add like 2 seconds. We're not concerned for that. And that Elo Shel Kol Adam, the concern was if it's not made by a professional, that is where they're going to making the form will take more time. Whichever version it was, the matzah that they were eating was made by the ones upon whom there was no such a gezeda, and they were lechatchila even allowed to make a matzah, right? That's called a sirikin, that has a design, that has a decorated design on it. Today we don't have such things, right? At least not to my knowledge. Today the matzahs are made very simple. And let's go weiter. Okay, Amar Rabbi Yosi, that oisin sirikin kimindikikin, that if you're making a thin, very thin matzah, then you can have it with a design as well. But the ein oisin sirikin kimin gilus ko'ois. But if you're making a matzah that is thick like a roll, and here's where Rashi says that's behemshuk to what we learned yesterday at the end of Lamed Vav, and the bottom on top of Lamed Zayin, that even though, like we mentioned, the Gemara understood the Baraisa not referring to a thick matzah, but there is in Shulchan Aruch this inyan of not having thick matzahs because they are more problematic. That's also from his statement, that Rabbi Yosi holds that when you have matzahs that are, like Rashi says, kimin kikin, that they are like wafers, they're very thin, right? And therefore, what to begin with, the thinner the matzahs, Dr. Rashi, the ein min mahadin lahachmitz, they are not that subject to becoming chametzik. So if you want to make them with a design, so let's say that whenever you make a design, you're going to add some time. It's going to take you another 10 seconds. I don't know, it's going to take you another 30 seconds, whatever it is. Doesn't matter, because you're starting out with something that to begin with needs a lot of time for it to become chametzik. The thinner, the better. However, if you're making matzahs that are thicker, they're like geluskois, they're like rolls. And I'm reading inside the Rashi, the metoich oivion, because of their thickness, the thicker the bread is machmitzim b'shehiyah mu'etes, they're subject to becoming chametzik even with a lesser amount of time. So that's his shita. You're making a thicker matzah, that don't make any design on that. Don't make a design and thick matzahs. So here again, aside of the havamina of the baraisa that we had at the end of Lamed Vav Amid Beis, here it's not a havamina. Here it's not changed. Here we clearly see from this Tana that the thinner the matzah b'chlal, the less possibility, the less potential it has to becoming chametzik, or you need a lot more lingering of time for it to become chametzik. And that's another reason why the minig now, I'm not only speaking about the Ashkenazim, I'm speaking even about those who have like a lafa type of matzah. It's not that thick, right? It can be like a pita bread, but it's not that the tefach that we spoke about. We don't have matzahs that are thick like a tefach. True, in the Beis Hamikdash, again, the kahanim were zerizim, like we had on top of the Amid, and they had all the other advantages of having a oven shamateches, and they had it all warmed up, and the wood was dry, v'chule, v'chule. They're fine. That's what God wanted, obviously. Lechem apanim was had a tefach thickness, but again, matzahs, and as is our minig, the thinner, the better, not for taste, but as far as it's more removed from ever becoming chametzik. Okay, we're up to the Aleph from the Bach, Tana Rabbanan. And here we go, Chaver, the whole daf from now until the end, almost until the end of Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, is speaking about the definition of lechem. And this nekuda of what happens if you fry the dough in a pan and not bake in an oven, whether it's called lechem, and it's negeya hand in hand, whether therefore you can be yoytze the mitzvah of eating lechem oini when you're mechuyev to eat matzah, now in galus of both nights of the Seder, as well as you're obligated to separate challah. The chiyuv challah is only if what you are making is called bread and not, we'll see, not pastry, not noodles, perhaps. And here, this is the very, very important sugya. Tana Rabbana. So we're going to speak about 4 unusual types of breads. One is called sufganim. Sufganim, let's touch into sponge bread. Number 2 is dufshanim, honey bread. Honey bread is bread that was fried in honey. After it was bread, it was fried in honey. Then you have the iskiritin, which are wafers. Okay, wafers, according to most Rishonim, that's something that's made with a very thin batter. We're going to speak about the thin batter in a moment. And v'chalas hamasres, and pan loaf. We'll define that in a moment. These 4 unusual types of breads. And now we're going to learn about a 5th item, which is like in a separate category. Hamaduma. Hamaduma is if you had a mixture between grain that's chulin and grain that's truma. And as we know, we learned so many times together that when you have such a mixture, truma only is nullified if the ratio of chulin against it is 100 to 1. When you don't have that ratio, then the whole mixture is called meduma. It's a mixture, meaning that I know that it's not all truma, but a Yisrael or a non-Kohen cannot eat of it because there's truma in it. Now, it's good to know that truma, challah is never separated from truma. So not only is challah not separated from truma, but if the truma caused other grains to become meduma, it's going to have a status of truma because there is no bittul, so that also will be exempt from challah, p'turim and challah. So again, the p'turim and challah and meduma, that's because, like we mentioned, because challah is never removed from truma. Now, when it comes to the 4 types of loaves, that's what we'll have to clarify. Now, first of all, what's the 4th one? What's chalas hamasres? What's called pan loaf? So I'm Rabbi Shobin Levi, ze chalut shobalabatim. It's a bread that prior to you baking it, you scalded the flour with water. We're going to learn a lot about that on Amud Beis. All right. Again, it's very halacha l'maisa. There's so many different opinions exactly how this bread was made. It was certainly not made in the normal fashion, and therefore it goes into the category of the sufganim and dufshanim and the iskeritim. Now, Amar Reish Lakish, here we start. Says Reish Lakish that all of the 4, let me explain to you why the Baraisa says they are exempt of challah, because they're not called lechem, because maise ilfasein. That's the key. Since they were fried in a pan, they were not baked in an oven. According to Reish Lakish, if something is made by putting it into a pan, we're not speaking about deep frying. Even if there's no liquid in the pan or just a minute amount, it shouldn't adhere to, it shouldn't get stuck. So you're sticking it onto the pan, basically. And don't forget, in the ovens, the way the breads were baked in the ovens, bisman mayhem, is that or even now when you make pita, you would stick it to the wall of the oven. So you have the dough and it's stuck to the wall, but in an oven, that's called bread. If you stick it onto the pan, and according to Reish Lakish, and you put the pan on the fire, we're going to learn more details on Amud Beis, whether the fire is underneath the pan or whether the fire is above the pan. According to it's made in the pan, it's not called lechem. And that's why the first 4 items in the Baraisa, they're p'turim and challah, because challah only has to be removed from lechem with the minimum share. You can have the share, but it's not lechem. Rabbi Yechanan disagrees with Reish Lakish. And he says that even breads, pastries that were made in a pan, they were fried and not baked, maise ilfis are still chayaven. Just because it was made in a pan doesn't take it away from the status of lechem. That's the whole machlokes of today. In the Baraisa, so if that's the case of ganim and dufshanim and iskeritin and chalas hamasres, why does the Baraisa say they are exempt? That's different. Because v'halolu sha'ason b'chama, they were made in the sun. And since they were made in the sun, they're tak exempt from challah. And with all of the Rishonim asking, not all, but the big question here is that when we left Mitzrayim, how did the matzahs get baked? We say this, it got baked on our backs, right? We didn't have time to prepare the bread. And that's mamish sha'ason b'chama. So what are we saying? That the matzahs that our forefathers ate over there were not considered lechem? And the answer is no, it was not considered lechem. Don't forget that the obligation that we had to eat matzah, which we had in Pesach Mitzrayim, was to eat the matzah with the Koren Pesach. That we did when we were still in Mitzrayim. We left Mitzrayim midnight was when Makas B'chayres happened. That was baked in an oven, or at least according to Rabbi Yochanan, baked in a frying pan, which is also considered baked. And Anachanami, that the other breads that we had when we were walking in the desert and it baked on our backs, Shason B'chama, L'kul Alma, that's not called lechem. And if there would have been an obligation then to eat challah, then we would not be yoysim with that. Okay. Now, before we go weiter, I want to jump ahead. It's a very easy daf. But this nekuda, and I know we learned in the Shulchan Aruch recently, we're learning the dinim of making brachos, in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, pas haba b'kisanin. This is going to be a very important topic. So Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are debating whether something made in a pan is considered lechem or not. Turn to Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. Turn over to Amid. Go in middle of the third Tosfos. The L'kula Alma Maise Ilfus Peturim. I'm going mamash in middle of the Amid, in the beginning of a line. Now, this is the only sheet of the Rabbeinu Tam. All the Rishonim argue with the Rabbeinu Tam. But listen to what Rabbeinu Tam writes. Now, where do we have this? Where do we have this statement? The Dafka, the Biliyosoi, Racha Pligi. They are arguing only if the batter is very light, it's very liquidy. Just to know the definition in halacha of a liquidy batter or not is that when you make the dough, if you turn the keli upside down, does it pour out? That's called a liquidy batter. Like cakes are made with a liquidy batter. That's mamash also negaya today. Do you separate challah? How do you prepare it? This is the sugya. What bracha do you make, which is connected to our topic? It's not exactly, but it's connected. The Rabbi Yochanan Savar. This is the Rabbeinu Tam Shita. That afi yosei beilfus lechem. That when you have even a light batter, a liquidy batter, and you make it, you finalize the product in a pan. Chayv and challah. The Shlakish is the one that holds that einoi seil lechem upator. But avol zok Rabbeinu Tam bits bili losay ava. If the batter is thick, it's what we call the dough. Kula alma moida that you chayv and challah. And not only are you chayv and challah, if you bake it in a pan without liquid in the pan, but I feel on the mashka, even if you deep fry something, according to the Rabbeinu Tam, if the batter is thick, everyone holds that you chayv and challah. I'm going to give you one. This is so halacha l'maisa. Noodles. Was there an obligation to separate challah from noodles? Noodles is fried, but it's a thick batter. According to the Rabbeinu Tam, that noodles can be hamoitzi. I'm also connecting to the brachas. It's all connected. It doesn't have to go hand in hand, but there's a big connection. All the other Rishonim argue with this Rabbeinu Tam. And look inside the Tosfos, who Taka mentions the brachas over here, whether you make mezainis, whether you make hamoitzi. The Rabbeinu Tam really limits the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbeinu Tam says that they are only arguing when the belila is racha, belila of a thick batter. Everyone holds that it's considered lechem, and therefore for our sugya you chayv and challah. For our sugya you can be yoytze the mitzvah of eating matzah. Obviously, if it's not chametz, God forbid. And perhaps, according to many, and you make a bracha of hamoitzi. All the other Rishonim say absolutely not, that the machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is no matter, doesn't make a difference. Even if it's belila ava, even if it's a thick batter, if it's what we call the dough, it doesn't pour out. And that is where we have shitas Rabbi Reish Lakish that says that maise ilfis, if it's made in a pan, it's not called bread. This is a big machlokes, chavra. Anyways, let's go back to our Gemara. So we're back to Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. Just remember.
But what are we pasking today in terms of a dough that's made in a pan?
Alter Rebbe brings down, even though in the Shulchan Aruch we don't accept the Rabbeinu Tam Shita, right? But the Shita is brought down according to certain opinions. The Yeshayim.
Okay, I'm just saying, forget about Rabbeinu Tam for a second. But if you have an actual dough made in a pan between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, and the machlokes the way everybody else understands it, what taka do we do with that? You have a dough that's made in a pan.
So Danny, we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that Maise Ilfus is chayiv. The only thing is, 1 second, that Maisa Ilfis, the way that is only if there is no moisture in the pan. In other words, Maisa Ilfis will mean that you stick it onto the pan. You can put a little bit of oil. It shouldn't get stuck, or it shouldn't burn on the pan. But the moment you deep fry it, that's the way we paskin. That's the even Rabbi Yochanan will hold that you're not chayiv challah. That Rabbeinu Tam clearly doesn't say that. And Rabbeinu Tam says that if it's belila ava, you can deep fry it. I think lakshin is the big thing. What is lakshin? Mezoinus or hamoitzi? Are you mechuyev to separate the challah? That's the sugi here. Pesachim daf lamed zayin. Let's come back over here. Now meisvei. So the Gemara is going to first try. The kasha will be here against the shlakish. It says in a braisa again hasuv ganim, this type of sponge bread, the haduf shanim and honey bread, is kevitain and wafers. So it says in the braisa ason beilfis chayavim. Clearly, if they are made in a pan, they're chayiv and chal. It's called lechem. Only if it's made in the sun, that's when it's peturim. So l'cha'ida teyufta dereshem men lakish. Answers Ula, no, it doesn't refute him. Amar Ula, Amar Lachashem men lakish. No, this is now we're learning the Gemara. That what is the Braisa talking about? That that you preheated the pan. Guys, also appreciate that the way you bake things in the oven is you stuck it to the wall of the oven. Here you're sticking it to the pan. We're not speaking about deep fried. The pan is on the fire. So really, if the pan was preheated and you stick the dough onto it and now it, whatever you call it, fries, no, everyone knows it's called baked. Just because it's on a pan and it's not in an oven, it's the same thing. Where does they argue? Where does Reish Lakish say that Maise Ilfis is by default not considered challah, not considered lechem? That is if you put it in the pan before the pan was preheated. And then it slowly heats up on the fire. Interesting. That's what the Gemara says. That's where the Shlakish says. That's where you have the machlokes. Abel, the Gemara counters. What are you telling me? That if hidbik, at first you put the this dough, this batter in the pan, and then you warm up the pan. My hachinami, according to the Shlakish, that you'll be potter from challah. So asks the Gemara, Adatani Seifa, why did the Braisa have to make a differentiation between Ilfis and son, that a son b'chama pturin make a better differentiation? Lifleit v'litne b'dida. B'med dvar mamurim ki goin shir tiach l'b'say feedback. Abel hidbek was over tiach, then pturin. If that's the case, the Gemara says in Chanami, that's exactly what the Braisa is saying. B'suri mechsre v'hachiktani. B'med dvar mamurim that you're chayiv and challah. Even though these batters are made, these doughs are made in a pan, it's sheirtiach ulabasoy feedback. That's only if the pan was preheated prior to you putting into it this dough. Avol hidbik ulabasoy firtiach. All of this is what really the Braisa is saying. Then nase kemish ason b'chama, and therefore they are peturim. Another tashema, another attempted refutation against the shita of Reish Lakish that holds that Maisa Ilfis is not called bread. It says in the Braisa that yoitzin, you can be yoitzin the mitzvah of eating matzah, but matzah hina. Matzah hina means half-baked matzah. We'll see what that means, half-baked. And you can be yoitzin the mitzvah of eating matzah, uba matzah ho asuya beilfis. Clearly. No, if you have matzah that's made in a frying pan, you can be yoitza the mitzvah. Challah and matzah mamish go hand in hand. Again, the Rishonim, like we mentioned in the Tosfos, whether the brach of hamoitzi and mezoinus, there's a link. They don't have to go hand by hand. But if it's lechem, you can be yoitza the mitzvah of eating matzah, and you're obligated to take off challah. It goes together. So if the Braisa is saying that you're yoitza the mitzvah of matzah, even though it was made in an ilfis, is araya, that's that bread that's made in a frying pan, that's called lechem. Kasha against Reish Lakish. The answer is the Gemara. I already gave you the answer. That hachinami, yeah, everyone holds that if shehirtiach, at first the pan was preheated, and then when the pan is already benedict, you put onto it the dough, that's called baked. That's called baked, and it's not deep fried. Deep fried changes it, but it does. If you have just a little bit of oil, that's called baked. Okay, now before we go on, what does it mean, matzah hina? That half-baked, halb gebakt is oichel good. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, it means it has to be baked enough That kol sheporsa, if you break it apart, you don't have these strands pulling. So if you break a bread or a matzah and you have strands that are connecting one half with the other, that is already considered raw. That's not even halb gebakt. Halb gebakt, we know what it means. It means it wasn't done properly, but as long as you don't have the strands, that is what the Brais is saying. That's considered lechem, benegea to what? Benegea to you being able to fulfill your mitzvah of eating matzah. Amar Rava. V'chein lachmei toida. What's v'chein lachmei toida? Sagt Rashi, second to last line, that when you shecht a carbon toida, upon which you have to have the 40 loaves of bread, right? Groups of 10, 4 groups of 10, and the shchitas hazevach is that which is being mekadesh the lechem, and then the carbon toida is kosher. What happens if the breads that you prepared weren't fully baked? Once they reach this stage of hina, of they're baked enough that if you break them apart, you don't have the strands, then you have the loaves of breads, and therefore the toida is kosher. Says the Gemara Pshita, why would we think it's different? Last line in the Amid, right? Part of the question, hachi lachem ksiv and v'hachi lachem ksiv. So however you define lechem, it should be across the board. So the Gemara says, no, there's a chiddush. Mal the tema, I would have thought, hoyel v'ksiv, since it says a parshas tzav, and again the carbon toida, it says v'hikriv mimenu, that the owner has to offer to the kohen, daf lamed zayin amid beis, echad mikol carbon, one from each offering. Like we mentioned, he makes 40 loaves, but the 40 loaves that we make are really 4 types. 3 of them are matzah, 10 of them are taka, that's the one of the 2 exceptions, chametz, and then the owner has to give from each group of 10, 1 to the kohen. And the word 1 implies, says the Gemara, echad is shelo yitel parus, that you cannot give to the kohen a broken loaf. It has to be a shlema. So now you would think, when you have these hina breads, these half-baked breads, perhaps that it only after it becomes more baked can you say now it's considered wholesome. Before something is fully baked, it's like it's umrachen. Not because it's broken into 2 pieces, but because it's internally broken. It's not properly baked. The Baldik was the concept of parus, of brokenness. Doesn't mean you're made into 2 pieces. It means that you're not completed. It's uncompleted or incompleted. So kamash malan, it's not ideal, but the fact that there's no strands connecting one half to the other, it's considered baked. And that's what we have to emphasize that also works when it comes to kosher. Okay, weiter on the machloikas between Rabbi Yochanan and Ishlakish. Now the Gemara is going to challenge the shita of Rabbi Yochanan. Meisvei says in a brayso, Hami Isa. So we're going to be learning about 2 types of breads before we come to whether they're fried in a pan, whether they're baked in the oven. Here we're speaking about flour that it underwent a step of scalding it. And there are 2 ways of scalding flour, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, for people that are bakers, these are techniques that are done today. Hame Isa, all right, a type of scalded bread. So Beis Shammai says that it was like heated up with water, pturim it's pater from challah, which would mean it's not called lechem. Beis Hillel, no, just because you scalded the flour, you're still chayiv in challah. Ha-chalita, another type of scalded bread. We'll see in the Gemara, we'll explain the difference between the isa and chalita. Here, our version is that there's still a machloikis, but they take the opposite sides. Beis Shammai here are machayvin, you're chayvin challah, and Beis Hillel are poitrin. Okay. Now let's define a zeh ha-meisa ve'ezeh ha-chalita. They're both breads that when you had the flour, one step was you scalded it with hot water. Explains the Gemara, ha-meisa is kemach sha'al gabe muglashin, flour that's poured over boiling water. So wherever you have the boiling water, the flour is on top, the boiling water is on the bottom. Ha-chalita, it's the same thing. You're going to scald the flour, but it's punt faket. It's mugulashim shal gabe yakemach. The water goes over the flour. So that's the difference. Now, why would Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel go to opposite positions? We'll see to that in a moment. But before we clarify Beishamai and Beisilo, now the Braisa brings down a third shita. Rabbi Yishmael, but Rabbi Yosi Yoimer, in the name of his father, Rabbi Yosi, Zevaz Eleftur. No difference between a meisa, a chalita. If you scalded the flour, it's no longer considered bread. It's not really bread, and therefore it's exempt from challah. But Amrila, other people say that Rabbi Shmuel Shita, B'Shem's father, was the opposite. Zevaz Elechiyuv. The Chachamim say, nah, I don't care about the scalding part. This is the part of the Braisa that will be a kasha on Rabbi Yechanan. Echad zeh ve'echad zeh. Whether you put the water on top of the flour on top of the water. You want to know whether you have to separate challah. It's about what happens next. If ason be'ilfis, that's the key. If it was then fried in a pan, then you're potter. You're clear. This is the kasha against Rabbi Yechanan. If it was then baked in the oven, then you're chayiv. Nekuda. Now, before we verbalize the question against Rabbi Yechanan, the Gemara now just wants to understand, like we mentioned, that the way we have our girsa, meisa and chalita, both cases, machlekes b'shamai and b'silo, but they take opposite positions. Why would that? What difference would it make as far as the chiyuv challah is concerned? Whether the flour is poured over the boiling water, whether the boiling water is poured over the flour, the tanakama, maishnaha meisa, maishnaha chalita. It shouldn't make a difference. It shouldn't make a difference. Whatever b'shamai holds, you should hold consistently, and likewise b'silo. So indeed, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, V'chein Amar Rabbi Yehuda, V'teim Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that the version in our Braisa was corrupted. It's wrong. Kemachloikes bezu, kach machloikes bezu. Look inside the Rashi, 8 lines from the top of the Amid. Kemachloikes bezu, said Rashi, Kolemer, Hamachai bezu, Machai bezu. V'hapoite bezu, poite bezu. No, they don't change the opposite sides when it comes to Me'is and Chalita. And Vereisha the Mapich Plutayu Lav Chada Tanamrinu. There are 2 different versions, what Beishamai says, what Beisilo says. And Vekashin Adodi, and they're contradicting each other. And indeed, look back inside the Gemara V'Tavra. This Braisa is a contradiction. It's not correct. In other words, yes, there is a Machloikes Tanoim, what Beishamai and Beisilo say. But whichever position they say, they are consistent, not the way it appears in the Braisa. Either in both cases, Beishamai says you're chayiv, or in both cases, Beishamai says you're pater, and whenever Beishamai says, Beisilo says the opposite position. Misha shanazu, leishanazu. Okay, now that we clarified that, coming back to Akasha against Rabbi Yechanan from the sheet of the Chachamim.
That means one of them is the same as Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yosi.
Mamish, right? Mamish. And it's funny that there's 2 versions of what he said. Like we don't know which one they said, but we're not. One thing is clear.
It's either like Beis Shammai or like Beis Hillel, basically.
There you go. Now, Katanemias, that the Chachamim say, the Chachamim don't care whether you scalded the flour in water. Echad zeh, this is the only criterion that we're looking at to know whether you're chayiv and challah. That shason be'ilfis, if you make them in a pan, you're potter. Only if you make it in a tanner, then you're chayiv. So to yufta the Rabbi Yechanan. Now this is.
Ask you a question here for a second on this question.
Sure.
Why is it a tiyufta if the Chachamim are dafka talking about this special type of bread, whatever it's called, this meisa stuff, right? So why can't Rabbi Yechanan say, well, a regular flour, the Chachamim would agree that however you make it, it's considered bread. It's only by this weird flour, the scalded flour, that's where he says it makes a difference of a frying pan. Why is it a tiyufta?
The Gemara doesn't answer that because from the Lashon it's mashma that we don't care that it was scalded. Echad zeh ve'echad zeh. It's mashma from the Lashon that it's like irrelevant. Echad zeh ve'echad zeh. Did you make it in a pan? All I want to hear about is whether you made it in a pan. And Rabbi Yechanan takas moida that yeah, you're right. You quoted me a braisa, and according to these chachamim, yeah, maise ilfis is going to be exempt from challah. How can I argue with a Tana? There's a machlokes tanoihi. Now, not everyone is going to understand the pshat in the following brayse the way Rabbi Yechanan does, but Rabbi Yechanan has what to stand on. The Tanya, yochel yehei meisa v'chaluta chayavin b'chala. These types of scalded flour, you would think they're chayav and chala. So Talmud Leimer says the Tanakama lechem. Obviously, the Tanakama understands that lechem excludes flour that was first scalded in boiling hot water. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ein lechem elo ha'ofa b'taner. A lechem is only that which was baked in the oven. And hold on, what are we talking about? How does Rabbi Yehuda argue How does he argue? Rabbi Yehuda Hainu Tanakama. Okay? The fact that you're boiling it in water, in other words, the Tanakama L'chayda is saying is that you're not chayven challah because it wasn't baked in the oven. So Elamat, no, that's not there. There has to be an argument. Elalav, that's the way Rabbi Yechanan understands this. But I saw Maise Ilfasik Beinayum. Tanakama holds that Meisa and Chaluta, right? If they would be later made in an Ilfas, they would be chayiv. Maise Ilfas chayavin. Right? I'm sorry, fakir. The Tanakama holds the only thing that we don't want is for it to be scalded. If it was scalded, then you're never going to be chayiv challah. That's what the Tanakama says. But if it's not scalded in hot water, then it's always going to be chayiv in challah. Always, meaning even if it's made in the oven. Oh, Gavaldi. And Rabbi Yehuda therefore says that aside of scalded being excluded from, no, Maisa Ilfis is what excludes it. Maisa Ilfis Peturim. That's the way Rabbi Yechanan understands this brayso. And now he has the Tanakama of Rabbi Yehuda to lean on that holds that Maisa Ilfis is still considered bread. The only thing the Tanakama doesn't want is for it to be scalded. But you take out that problem as long as it's not scalded, you're going to be chayiv challah, even if it was made fried in a pan. However, the Gemara says that lav dafka, that's pshat in the brayso. Loi.
So, Rabbi, the bakeries that make donuts, they don't take challah from that dough?
All of the exactly. Samach, this is the big sugya here. In other words, what really comes into play is the Rabbeinu Tam. I'm telling you, that's the big thing over here.
So, if I buy frozen dough in the supermarket that I have to go home and bake, did the bakery that made that dough take challah, or am I expected to take challah from it because they don't know what kind of pan I'm going to use that dough in?
I'm sure the hashgachas will let you know what you need to do. I'm not familiar. I'm not a baker. So I'm like you.
Commercial bakeries, they make all types. The flour shows up, and some gets fried, some gets baked, some gets raw, some gets. How did they make a cheshbon? Which flour is going for what? What do we have to take challah? What don't we have to take challah for?
I'm sure that they write in it challah genumen. I remember in Yiddish and all the pekla challah genumen.
By the way, there's one mistake here, Tzemach, that you're making. That if it's deep fried like a donut, then the chol hadayis that's not called baking. It says that over here in the notes.
No. Very good, Danny. No. Not
that's cooking. That's cooking.
No, not that. That's the whole word. That Rabbeinu Tam says that clearly here. That Rabbeinu Tam says that if bililosei ava, even if it's deep fried.
Not deep fried in liquid. Deep fried in liquid is considered cooking. L'chol hadayis, even according to Rabbeinu Tam.
No, okay, Nachama, we have time. Look inside the Tosfos. It's mamash on this line. The dafke bililosei ra kapli Rabbi Yechanan savar afisai ilfis lechem. However, avo bililosei ava kula alma moide b'chayev b'chala. Danny, afilu alidei mashke. Alidei mashke means deep fried, even if it was not just put in a frying pan without liquid. No, this is big. The Rabbeinu David argues, the other Rishonim argue with the Rabbeinu Tam, but this is Shittas Rabbeinu Tam. And he goes further. He's mamish samach. The Rabbeinu Tam is saying what you're saying. He's saying, when are you mechuyev to take off challah? From when you mix the flour and the water. So who cares what you're going to do later? He says, if you make a thick dough, you have to separate challah right away. I don't care how you're going to do it later. Mamash, that you're touching on that nakuda. And the other Rishonim say no. It says that I don't care that you made it a thick dough. What is your intent? Your intent of how you will finalize it will be machriya, whether you chayiv now to separate challah or not. Beautiful. That's the machlokes. The Rabbeinu Tam is saying, I don't care if it's thick. You chayiv to take off challah no matter what. Even deep fried. I'm telling you the big kasha.
Okay, but we're not pasking like a Rabbeinu Tam, right? I mean, everyone else holds not like that.
It's not, it's not so simple. Yeah, paskening or not paskening. Many times you have certain shittas in Shulchan Aruch that say that the yesh oimrim and v'toiv lahachmir. And to get out of the doubt, it's a shita that's brought down. Correct. We don't paskin like the Rabbeinu Tam, but it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch. Let's go right. So the Gemara says again, loy meaning that
if somebody's making donuts, they should be mafresh challah.
Not according to the Rabbeinu Tam. Yes, let me word it that way. Okay. Again, we don't paskin like that. But loy the kula alma malsi infas pturin. I'm going to argue that no one agrees to that. What is the machlokes between the Tanakh and Rabbi Yehuda? It was fried. But what happens if after you fry it, now you bake it? I don't even know how how bagels are made. Are bagels made that way, or bagels are only fried? Or is there frying and then baking?
Bagels are boiled in
boiled.
They're boiled in water.
But then they're baked.
They're baked in an oven.
Then they're baked. Oh, so very good. So that's what you're talking about. So here, first it was fried, and then it was baked. The Tanach holds that since at the end, and Rabbi Yehuda Savad know that ein lechem elo ha'ofi betanu meikara. The moment it went through the phase, the even the meikara la betanu afiyeh, because it was fried. That's it. It removed it from being lechem, lav lechem, or even if later you baked it in the oven. And on that, Amar Rabbi, this is the understanding of the machlokes. What would be the rationale? What will be the source of Shitas Rebbe Yehuda? And this is based on the Teichachan B'Chukoisai, where it says that va'afu esed nashim lachmechem betanur echad, right? So it says Rava, understanding the source of Rabbi Yehuda, that lechem that's only baked in a tanur echad. Tanur echad means not that never 10 women will have so little bread that they all fits in one oven. That the only thing done was a tanur. This product was made in the tanur, not in something else in a tanur. That's when it's lechem. But the she'ein offer betana yachad, knows if it wasn't that it became from dough into bread by a tanur. No, first you fried it and then you baked it. Then ain't a kadol lachem. We have time. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. When I get to this machlokes Rabbi Yechanan and Shlakish, that Yosef Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef achoyre de Rabbi Zera. The Yosef Rabbi Zera kamei de Ula. So get it. Ula is the teacher. Ula is facing the Talmidim. The way to work then is that the better the Talmud, the closer up you were. The opposite of today. Today, the Talmidim that learn good get no attention, because if you're not going to give attention to those who are not learning, you have to bring the non-learneds close. There, everyone was learning. The more qualified, the closer up you came. So Ula's the teacher. Who's in the front row? Who's the master Talmud, Rab Zera? And behind Rab Zera is Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef. So if Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef want to ask a question to Ula, they can't ask the Rebbe directly. They whisper their questions to Rab Zera, and they were hoping that Rab Zera would ask it weiter to Ula. But he was like the buffer. So Amalei Rabba to Rab Zera, do me a favor. Boy mi name Ula. Why don't you ask Ula, Hidbik mi bafnim, v'irtiach mi bachutz. If you put the dough inside the frying pan, and the fire is on the other side, which is, by the way, exactly the way you envision frying something on a pan. Everything that we fry in a pan is that the fire is on the opposite side of the product. The product is in the pan, and the fire is underneath it. Mao, what's the din? Does it become lechem or not? So Rab Zera tells Rabba, I don't understand. My emole, what exactly do you expect me to ask of Ula? You want me to ask this to Ula? Why should I ask that from Ula? The Iaminole, if I were to repeat your question, I know what he's going to answer. Is Amali, Hi Ninu, my Silfas. This is the machlokes, Rabbi Yechanan and Shlakish. We are expected to know that machlokes. That's the machlokes. Rabbi Yechanan, Rabbi Shlakish says the Potter Menachalo, and that shitas Rabbi Yechanan that no, my Silfas is Chayv and Chal. Good. So that's not being asked. So then the other one, Rabbi Yosef asks Rabbi Zera, oh no, ask something else of Ula. What happens if you put the dough inside the pan, but you don't put the fire under the pan? Somehow you have how to bring the fire on top of the pan. Guys, this l'chayda should be mamish like an oven. I know it's not enclosed in an oven, but what happens in an oven? You have the fire on the floor of the oven, and inside the walls, you're sticking the dough on the walls of the oven. So if you're putting it in the pan, and somehow you're bringing the pan under the fire.
I think it means like a broiler. That's where the flame is on top, right? That's the idea.
Broiler. Now, the only thing is that a broiler that I have in my house is in an oven. It's in an oven. Here, it's not in an oven. So you're putting it on a pan. So here, at least over here, Rabbi Yosef thought that might not be their machlokes. But here again, Amalei, Rabbi Zera tells him, my Amalei, what do you want me to ask of Ula? The Iaminolei, If I'm going to ask your question again, Amali, Roy Vaniyam Oisim came. This is how they used to break in the frying pan. Okay, Aniyim, they couldn't afford an oven, but they had a pan. That's how they made it. No, it's this again. This is the machlokes between a Shlakish and Rabbi Yechanan. All right, let's start the new sugya, my friend. Says the Gemara, Omar Avasi, Isa shel meiser sheni. If you make dough with meiser sheni grain, Ledivrei Rabbi Meir, according to Rav Meir, who, what, when, where, Zot Rashi. We are referring to Rav Meir in Kiddushin Daf Nun Daled Amud Beis. What does Rav Meir hold? That meiser mamoin gevayahu. Meiser means meiser sheni. Even though that I get to eat it in Yerushalayim, it's not mine. It belongs to the Eibishter, and God is inviting me on His table. But it's a mammon gevaya. According to Rav Meir, says Rabasi, for sure you are exempt from separating challah. Why? Says Rashi at the end of the Amid, Kidim Efarish, like we'll see on Daf Lamed Ches, that it says in Parsha Shalach, Ari Shoisechem, not a dough, your dough. Okay, so if it's not yours, right, V'lo shel gevaya, and this is Taka gevaya. It's mamain gevaya. So back inside the Gemara, according to Rav Meir, P'turim Anachal, but that's only if you hold that meiser is mammon gevaya. But l'divrei chachamim, the end of the Amid, you're chayiv in challah. It's yours. Taka, there are restrictions. You can only eat it in Yerushalayim and HaKodesh. But if it's yours, you have to take away challah. We're going to learn 3 dinim. Next, Daf Lamed Ches. Let's go with the 3 dinim. Then we're gonna chazer it tomorrow. What about matzahs? Matzah shel meiser sheni. Don't jump. Yes, we learned this on Daf Lamed Vav. We learned the machlokes between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva. We're going to get back to that. It's linked. But he's discussing it. Ravasi is saying, matzos of meiser sheni. Nachamo, ledivrei Rav Meir, ein adam yoytze b'yedei chavasa b'Pesach. Look inside the top Rashi. That the afilu, what's the chiddush? That even if you're not going to darshan oini, lechem oini, the way Rabbi Yossi Haglili darshan oini means from aninus, only that which you could eat, even in a state of aninus, could you fulfill your mitzvah of matzah? So Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, meiser sheni, that we're taka, l'kula alma, not allowed to eat in the state of aninus, no machlokes tanoim over here, then you can't fulfill, not according to that. The chiddush of Ravasi is that even if we go like Rabbi Akiva, we don't darshan oini miloshan aninus. Nevertheless, be'inan matzah shaloi v'loi shel gevaya. That's the chiddush of Ravasi. It has to belong to you. And not to God. The problem is that I get it by Chal and Parsha Shalach. It says Arisoy Seichem. When it comes to the mitzvah of eating matzah, the Torah says to eat matzah. The Torah doesn't say matzaschem. So that's where we're going to take off tomorrow. That will be the kasha on. I don't care. Why would Rav Meir come into play? But that's what he's saying. That if it's not yours, even if you don't darshan lechem oini ayin aleph. Lo yotza, lo ein adam yoytze b'yedei chavos b'Pesach, but l'divrei chachamim, yes, yoytze b'yedei chavos. Obviously, the Rabbi Akiva. Again, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you can't fulfill the mitzvah because it's not lechem oini. And now the third din of Ravasi, esroik, same nekuda. Here again, we're going to have to find out where do we find the esroik has to be yours. But esroik shel meiser sheni l'divrei Rav Meir, again that holds in kedushin that meiser mamoin gevaya. Yes, Adam yoytze b'yedei chavasoi b'yantiv. We'll stop over here, and then we're going to learn the Gemara. Obviously, again, like we mentioned, that is seichem by the esrog or l'kachtem lochem. Everyone knows, but what's this matzah? There's no matzaschem l'choira. Why does Rav Meir come into play? To be continued.
Yeah. Rabbi, I think there's some Chassidus interpretation of the questions of Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef that they were asking to Zera to ask Ula. There's got to be something there, right? Like these obvious questions, he's telling them it's not a question. Well, what's the real question? Anyhow.
You don't know, we have to think what's baked, what's fried. Like, what does that mean also?
With the fire on top, the fire on bottom, Rabbi. Is that Isrusa del Sata, Isrusa del Leila?
For sure.
All right.
Now I understand what they meant in the Torah when they told me to Visnish der Bakken.
Visnish der Bakken is Halb der Bakken. That's the Halb der Bakken. That's mamish the lashon from the Gemara. It's amazing. One guy said it, and that's a gechapt. Right,
have a good day,
Rabbi. One of this with the scalding flour.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe the machlokes could have something to do with tata gavar. See, Taisus talks about it, but I don't know what he's talking about.
Sure. That was I'm talking about the machlokes b'sham and b'silul with the
Yes.
Eloi gavar, tata gavar.
So I see Taisus talks about it. It seems like it's a question, but do you know what Taisus is saying?
No, I didn't see it.
Okay.
Good.